Welcome to Sleepy Crimes. I am Anna, your host. Tonight, we drift into the shadows of Sandy Irvine and the mystery of 1924. Imagine the world as it was then, unmapped in the high places, a vast white silence that seemed to touch the stars themselves. We are standing on the edge of the world, where the air is too thin to hold a secret for long, yet deep enough to swallow two men whole. Let your breath slow down as we climb through the history of the most famous disappearance in mountaineering. Close your eyes and feel the bite of the cold as it settles over the roof of the world, a place where the line between the earth and the heavens becomes blurred, and the silence is heavier than the snow. We are traveling back to a time of silk and wool, of heavy steel cylinders, and the absolute quiet of the upper atmosphere. It is the morning of June 8th, 1924. At 26,800 feet, the morning light does not arrive with warmth. It is a pale, translucent gray that creeps over the jagged peaks of the Himalayas, slowly illuminating the vastness of the Rongbuk Glacier far below. Inside a single, small green tent perched precariously on a rocky ledge, the air is thick with the scent of paraffin and the heavy, rhythmic breathing of two men. This is Camp 6. It is a place where every movement is a struggle, where the act of tying a bootlace can leave a person gasping for air. The canvas of the tent flutters in the thin wind, a sound like a distant, frantic heartbeat against the overwhelming silence. Outside, the world is a vertical kingdom of ice and ancient stone, waiting for the sun to touch the summit of Everest. Sandy Irvine, only 22 years old, sits in the cramped darkness of the tent. He is the youngest member of the expedition, a man of incredible physical strength and a brilliant mechanical mind. His hands, though stiff and numb from the sub-zero temperatures, are steady as he works. Scattered around him in the tiny space are the heavy components of the oxygen apparatus, valves, pipes, and heavy steel cylinders. To the local porters, these are bottles of English air, a strange and mysterious magic. To Sandy, they are a heavy burden he has spent weeks perfecting. He has stripped away every ounce of unnecessary weight, reducing the rigs to 30 pounds of metal and hope. He knows that without this gas, the mountain will surely win. He has spent his last night on Earth adjusting these machines by the light of a small candle, ensuring that every seal is tight and every flow of life-giving air is constant and reliable. Beside him is George Mallory, a man whose name has become synonymous with the mountain itself. They share a breakfast of cocoa and perhaps a few biscuits, though hunger is a foreign concept at this altitude. Every calorie is forced down like medicine. They dress in layers of silk, wool, and gabardine, materials that seem fragile against the absolute zero of the high ridge. There are no synthetic fibers here, no high-tech plastics, just the natural warmth of animals and the grit of men. They pull on their heavy, nail-studded leather boots, a slow and agonizing ritual that takes nearly an hour. The silence between them is not empty. It is filled with the shared understanding of the risk they are taking. They are moving into the death zone, a place where the body begins to consume itself, where time becomes a blur of white and shadow, and every second counts. Sometime between 5 and 7 in the morning, they unzip the tent and step out onto the edge of the world. The sound of the metal zipper is shockingly loud in the still air. The sun has risen, but it offers no comfort. The sky above is a deep, bruised indigo, almost black, because there is so little atmosphere left to scatter the light. Below them, the world is a map of shadows and light, with the lower camps hidden away in the deep valleys. They shoulder their heavy oxygen sets, the metal frames biting into their wool-clad shoulders. Sandy feels the weight of the cylinders, 2 or 3 for each man, and the hiss of the regulator as he turns the valve. It is a mechanical hiss, a sound of survival in an environment that was never meant for humans. With a final look at the tiny camp that has been their only shelter, they turn toward the summit and begin the final climb. Their progress is agonizingly slow. Each step is a calculation of energy and willpower. They move through the yellow band, a geological scar of limestone that wraps around the mountain like a golden crown. The rock is brittle and slanted, making the footing treacherous under their heavy, spiked boots. Sandy follows Mallory's lead, his young lungs straining even with the help of the supplemental oxygen. They are moving through the ether now, separated from the rest of humanity by miles of vertical space. The wind begins to pick up, carrying fine grains of ice that sting their exposed skin like needles. But for a moment, the clouds part, and they see the summit pyramid looming above them, a perfect, terrifying triangle of rock and snow, so close they could almost reach out and touch the sky. They continue upward, two small figures against the infinite white. At 12:50 in the afternoon, another climber named Noel Odell looks up from a lower position on the mountain. The mist that has been swirling around the ridge suddenly clears for a few brief minutes, pulled back like a curtain by the hands of the wind. Through his binoculars, he sees two tiny black dots moving against the snow and the bruising blue of the sky. They are nearing a great rock step, moving with strength and purpose toward the top of the world. He watches as one figure, then the other, crests the ridge and disappears into a bank of clouds. It is a fleeting vision, a snapshot in time that will haunt the history of the mountain for a century. The mist rolls back in, thick and white and absolute. The dots do not reappear. The mountain remains silent. As the afternoon wears on, the world below waits for a sign, but there is only the wind and the falling snow, covering their tracks and beginning a mystery that will remain buried in the ice for decades to come. Before we return to the frozen silence of the mountain ridge, we must look back to the lush, damp air of the lowlands where a young man's journey truly began. Andrew Irvine, known to everyone as Sandy, was born in 1902 in the town of Birkenhead. From the very beginning, there was a restless energy in him, a quiet curiosity that demanded to know how the world was put together. His childhood was not one of idle play, but of constant tinkering. In the family garage at 56 Park Road South, Sandy created his own sanctuary. It was a place filled with the scent of oil, the cold touch of steel, and the rhythmic scrape of a file against metal. He inherited this mechanical mind from his mother, who had once developed a prototype for a clothes washing machine before the Great War. Sandy did not just play with toys. He dismantled them, understood their mechanical heart, and rebuilt them to be faster, stronger, and more efficient. As he grew, his reputation for brilliance followed him to Shrewsbury School. He was a boy who could look at a broken engine and see the solution before others had even identified the problem. While other students were lost in the abstractions of Latin and Greek, Sandy was collaborating with his chemistry masters on complex engineering designs. They worked on an interrupter gear for propeller planes and a gyroscopic stabilizer, ideas so advanced they were sent to the War Office for consideration. But Sandy was more than just a mind in a workshop. He was a force of nature. At the age of 17, on a summer holiday in North Wales, he decided to ride his motorcycle to the top of the Carnadow Mountains. There were no tracks, only steep, rocky slopes and thick mist, yet he pushed the machine where no one thought a vehicle could go. It was on those very slopes that he had a chance encounter with a geologist named Noel Odell, the man who would later watch him vanish into the clouds of Everest. By the time Sandy reached Merton College at Oxford in 1922, his physicality had become legendary. He was a titan on the water, a rower of such immense strength that he seemed to move the river itself. Imagine the scene at the Henley Peace Regatta or the famous boat race against Cambridge. The air is thick with the smell of the Thames, the sound of the crowd is a distant roar, and there is only the synchronized breath of the crew. Sandy sat in the boat, his broad shoulders and powerful arms providing the engine for the team. In 1923, he helped lead Oxford to a victory that would not be repeated for over a decade. He was described as a superman, a specimen of perfect health and endurance. Yet, when he retreated to his rooms at Merton, the athlete vanished, and the engineer returned. His college rooms were often filled with thick clouds of pipe smoke and the scattered parts of a somewhat imperfect oxygen apparatus that he had borrowed to study. The oxygen sets of the early 1920s were clumsy, heavy, and notoriously unreliable. They were metal skeletons that leaked precious air and weighed over 30 pounds, a crushing burden for anyone attempting to breathe at the edge of the atmosphere. Sandy saw these flaws not as obstacles, but as a challenge. He spent his nights at Oxford surrounded by gaskets, flow meters, and copper tubing. He took the machines apart down to the last screw, lightening the frames and simplifying the complex valves. He was only 21 years old when the call came to join the third British expedition to Mount Everest. General Bruce, the expedition leader, referred to the young undergraduate as a splendid experiment. He was 14 years younger than the average age of the team, a boy among veterans, but he possessed a unique combination of qualities that the older men lacked: the raw strength of an elite rower and the precision of a master mechanic. George Mallory, the charismatic heart of the expedition, was quickly drawn to the young Sandy Irvine. While Mallory was a poet of the peaks, a man who saw the mountain as a spiritual quest, he was also a pragmatist. He knew that to conquer the highest point on Earth, they would need more than just courage. They would need technology that worked. During the long sea voyage to India and the trek across the high, wind-swept plains of Tibet, Sandy became the expedition's indispensable handyman. In his workshop tent, he repaired everything from cameras and stoves to the heavy leather boots of his companions. But his primary focus remained the oxygen sets. He worked tirelessly, often with frostbitten fingers, to ensure that the breathing apparatus would not fail when it mattered most. Mallory watched the young man work and saw in him the perfect partner. He wrote home that Sandy could be relied on for anything, even if he was a man of few words. To Mallory, Sandy was the engine that would drive them to the summit. As the expedition moved higher into the thin air, the bond between the seasoned climber and the young prodigy deepened. Sandy's youth was no longer a concern. It was an asset. While other men struggled with the debilitating effects of the altitude, Sandy seemed to thrive on the hardship, his rowing honed lungs and heart pushing through the exhaustion. He had become the master of the very machines that would keep them alive in the death zone. When the time came to choose a companion for the final, most dangerous attempt on the summit, Mallory bypassed more experienced climbers in favor of the 22-year-old engineer. He chose Sandy because he knew that if the oxygen failed, Sandy was the only person who could fix it in the freezing dark. And so, the two men prepared their gear, checking every seal and every tank one last time. They were a study in contrasts. The graceful, aging hero and the powerful, silent youth, ready to step together into the great unknown of the upper mountain. As the expedition moved higher into the thin air, the bond between the seasoned climber and the young prodigy deepened. Sandy's youth was no longer a point of concern, but a source of vitality that the rest of the team drew upon. To understand why this young man, only 22 years old, found himself on the roof of the world alongside the legendary George Mallory, we must look back to the wood-paneled rooms of London in 1923. The Mount Everest Committee was searching for something specific for their third attempt. They didn't just need climbers, they needed a new kind of pioneer. They needed someone who could bridge the gap between human endurance and the growing necessity of technology. When Noel Odell, the expedition geologist, spoke of a young Oxford rower he had met in Spitsbergen, the committee listened. They saw in Andrew Irvine a physical specimen of rare power, an elite oarsman with the shoulders of a giant and a mind that could take apart a machine and put it back together in the dark. He was the experiment of the 1924 team, the young blood, meant to test the limits of what a new generation could achieve. Imagine the scene at the base of the mountain, where the air begins to sharpen with the scent of ice and stone. While the other climbers rested their weary legs, Sandy could often be found hunched over a makeshift workbench in the mess tent. The air in that tent would have smelled of machine oil and cold brass, a stark contrast to the vast, organic silence of the Himalayas. Sandy was the master of the oxygen apparatus, those heavy, cumbersome steel cylinders that the local Tibetans and Sherpas called English air. To many of the older mountaineers, these tanks were a necessary evil, a heavy burden that felt unsporting and clumsy. They were notoriously unreliable, prone to leaking and sudden failure at the most critical moments. But to Sandy, they were a puzzle to be solved. He spent hours with his tools, his fingers stained with grease and numbed by the cold, methodically checking every valve and every seal. He discovered that 38 of the cylinders provided to the expedition were leaking, a terrifying realization that could have spelled disaster for anyone relying on them in the death zone. With the focus of a clockmaker, Sandy began to strip away the excess. He was a mechanical genius in a world of wool and leather. He managed to reduce the weight of the oxygen sets from 33 pounds down to a more manageable 22 pounds. He removed entire cylinders and modified the breathing frames, refining the Mark V apparatus into something that actually felt like it belonged on a human back. You can almost hear the rhythmic hiss-click of the valves as he tested them in the stillness of the high-altitude nights. Every adjustment he made was a gift of time and energy to George Mallory. Mallory, who had once been skeptical of supplemental oxygen, began to see Sandy not just as a companion, but as his ticket to the summit. He watched the young man work, marveling at the way his large, powerful hands could manipulate the smallest, most delicate screws. Sandy's impact went beyond the oxygen. He repaired the cameras, the stoves that melted their precious snow into water, and even the hand generators that provided a flicker of light in the deepening shadows of the camp. There was a distinct sound to Sandy's work, a sharp, metallic clink as he marked his gear. He was known to take a small file and carve 3 distinct nicks into his belongings, a personal signature that ensured his customized tools would never be confused with the standard issue equipment. This small detail, 3 tiny scratches in the metal of his ice axe or the frame of his pack, was a testament to his meticulous nature. As they moved up the mountain, passing 23,000 feet and pushing toward the North Col, the weight of the world seemed to rest on those modified frames. The wind would howl against the canvas of their tents, a low, mourning sound that never truly stopped. But inside, the click of Sandy's tools provided a strange, industrial comfort. He was the one who ensured the tea could be boiled and the breath could be drawn. He was the silent architect of their survival, a young man who carried the technical hopes of an entire empire on his sturdy, rowing-trained back. The selection of Sandy Irvine was a gamble that was paying off in dividends of safety and efficiency. While the older men struggled with the transition to this new, technological era of climbing, Sandy thrived in it. He didn't have the decades of experience that Mallory possessed, but he had a freshness, an adaptability that was essential for the challenges of 1924. He was often seen with his hands deep in his pockets, his head bowed in thought, perpetually calculating flow rates and weight ratios. This quiet, mechanical obsession gave the team a sense of security. They knew that if a stove failed at 26,000 feet, Sandy could fix it. If a camera shutter froze in the sub-zero temperatures, Sandy would find a way to make it click. He was the bridge between the grit of the 19th century explorers and the precision of the 20th. As the light faded over the jagged peaks, casting long, purple shadows across the Rongbuk Glacier, the team looked at the young experiment and saw a man who had become indispensable. Now the climb continues. The oxygen sets are packed, their weight reduced by Sandy's own hand, and the valves are silent and sealed. The air is getting thinner, and every breath is a conscious effort, but the equipment is as perfect as a 22-year-old's ingenuity can make it. They are moving into the realm of the unknown, where the mechanical and the spiritual must finally meet. The metal of the canisters is cold against their spines, a constant reminder of the technology that allows them to linger where no human should. Sandy's 3 nicks are carved deep into his ice axe, ready to bite into the frozen crust of the upper slopes. The preparation is finished. The selection is justified. Now there is only the mountain, the English air, and the long, slow march toward the skyline. Close your eyes and feel the weight of the pack, the steady hiss of the mask, and the quiet confidence of a young man who truly believed he could fix the world, one valve at a time. The transition from the lush, emerald hills of Darjeeling to the stark, wind-swept heights of the Tibetan Plateau was more than a change in geography. It was a descent into a different world entirely. In late March 1924, the expedition set out with a sense of Victorian grandeur that seemed almost out of place against the raw, ancient landscape they were about to enter. The journey would cover over 350 miles on foot and by hoof, a trek that served as both a logistical nightmare and a necessary period of acclimatization. Behind them lay the humid tea gardens and the rhododendron forests of Sikkim, where the air was thick enough to taste. Ahead lay the high, thin atmosphere of Tibet, a place where the wind felt like a physical weight against the skin. As they crossed the Jelepla Pass, leaving the borders of India behind, the vibrant greens of the valley were replaced by a monochromatic world of gray, ochre, and deep, bruised purple. The earth beneath their boots turned to a fine, biting dust that rose in small, swirling ghosts with every step they took. The scale of the caravan was staggering. Hundreds of animals moved in a slow, undulating line across the horizon. There were shaggy, low-slung Tibetan ponies, stubborn mules, and the great, lumbering yaks that seemed to belong more to the earth itself than to any living species. The sound of the trek was a constant, rhythmic cacophony. The heavy, wooden clatter of pack frames shifting against leather, the deep, melodic tolling of the brass bells hanging from the lead yaks' necks, and the occasional sharp cry of a driver echoing across the emptiness. Sandy Irvine, just 22 years old and full of a quiet, focused energy, found himself in the middle of this moving village. While others focused on the horizon, Sandy's eyes were often on the hundreds of wooden crates lashed to the backs of the animals. These boxes held the future of the expedition: the modified oxygen cylinders, the spare valves, and the pressure gauges he had spent weeks perfecting. He knew that every bump in the road, every stumble of a mule, was a threat to the delicate instruments that would keep them alive on the mountain. Life on the plateau was a study in endurance. The sun at these altitudes was a harsh, white glare that burned the skin even as the wind froze the marrow in one's bones. The climbers' faces began to change. Their skin grew weathered and dark, and their lips cracked in the dry air. For Sandy, the physical toll was met with a relentless work ethic. When the caravan stopped for the night in the shadow of ancient stone fortresses like Fairy Dizong, the others might seek the warmth of their sleeping bags, but Sandy was often found hunched over a small candle or a sputtering oil lamp. He would spend hours meticulously cleaning the grit and dust out of the oxygen regulators. The Tibetan dust was everywhere, a pervasive, fine silt that found its way into every seal and every thread of the machinery. He worked with his large, capable hands, moving with the precision of a watchmaker despite the numbing cold. He was the expedition's handyman, the one who could fix a broken stove, a leaking valve, or a snapped camera mount. This constant labor was his way of mastering the environment, of asserting order over the chaos of the high desert. On the 5th of April, they reached Fairy Dizong, a place described by the men as the highest and filthiest town in the world. The massive stone fortress rose like a jagged tooth from the plains, surrounded by low, flat-roofed houses that seemed to huddle together for warmth. The air here was so thin that even a simple walk to the edge of the camp left the men breathless, their hearts hammering against their ribs. It was here that the true physical strain began to show. General Bruce, the charismatic leader of the group, was struck down by a flare-up of malaria, a cruel irony in such a frigid place. The command passed to Edward Norton, a transition that shifted the mood of the party toward a more somber, clinical focus. They moved on toward Shekar-di-Zong, the White Monastery, where the hillsides were painted in surreal shades of lemon yellow and rust red. The landscape looked like the mountain scenery of the moon, utterly devoid of trees or grass, a place where time seemed to have stopped 1,000 years ago. Sandy watched the monks in their crimson robes, a stark contrast to the khaki and tweed of the British climbers, and felt the immense distance between his life in Oxford and this ethereal, silent kingdom. The final leg of the approach led them toward the Rongbuk Valley. As the expedition wound its way deeper into the heart of the Himalayas, the mountains on either side grew taller, their peaks draped in permanent ice. The headaches from the altitude became a constant companion, a dull throbbing at the temples that refused to fade. Sleep was fitful, interrupted by the sound of the wind tearing at the tent canvas and the dry, hacking Everest cough that began to plague the men. Yet, on the 21st of April, as they climbed a small ridge above the Chiblung-Chu Valley, the clouds parted to reveal a sight that silenced every complaint. There, 60 miles away but appearing close enough to touch, was the north face of Everest. It was a massive, triangular pyramid of rock and snow, towering over the surrounding peaks with a terrifying, lonely majesty. A long, white plume of snow blew from its summit, streaming out like a banner in a gale. For the first time, the mountain was no longer a plan on a map or a dream in a London meeting room. It was a physical reality, a wall of stone that looked both beautiful and fundamentally hostile to human life. By the 28th of April, they arrived at the Rongbuk Monastery, the last outpost of civilization before the glacier began. The valley was a desolate stretch of boulders and moraine, where the wind never truly stopped its mournful howling. The men set up their base camp at the foot of the glacier, a city of small, canvas tents dwarfed by the immense scale of the peaks above. The yaks were unloaded, the hundreds of crates finally coming to rest on the frozen ground. Sandy Irvine stood in the center of the camp, his boots caked in Tibetan mud, looking up at the summit that loomed 10,000 feet above them. The long road from Darjeeling was over, but the true struggle was only beginning. The oxygen sets were ready, the supplies were staged, and the mountain waited in a cold, shimmering silence. The air was getting thinner now, every breath a conscious effort, as the shadow of the great peak began to stretch across the valley floor, swallowing the camp in the early evening chill. The transition from the spiritual quiet of the monastery to the brutal physics of the glacier was immediate. As the team pushed further into the frozen heart of the mountain, the reality of the thin air began to claw at their lungs. To George Mallory, the peak was a phantom that demanded every ounce of his spirit. But to 22-year-old Sandy Irvine, the mountain was a mechanical problem waiting to be solved. While the others rested their weary limbs in the biting wind, Sandy could often be found hunched over a collection of heavy, steel cylinders and tangled rubber hoses. These were the oxygen sets, the controversial and cumbersome machines the Sherpas called the English air. At sea level, the apparatus was a heavy burden, but here, where the pressure of the world seemed to evaporate, it was the only thing standing between a man and a slow, drifting consciousness. Sandy knew that if they were to reach the summit, they could not rely on the equipment as it had been delivered. It was heavy, weighing over 30 pounds, and its design was frustratingly prone to failure. In the silence of the high camps, the only sound was the metallic clinking of tools against steel as the young engineer began his solitary work. Sandy's hands, though numbed by the sub-zero temperatures, moved with a surprising grace. Back in his rooms at Oxford, he had been known to spend entire nights surrounded by the blue haze of pipe smoke, dismantling anything he could get his hands on to see how it functioned. Now, those same skills were being tested in the most hostile laboratory on Earth. The oxygen equipment they had brought was a source of constant anxiety. Upon inspection, Sandy had been appalled to find that many of the cylinders were already empty, their precious contents hissed away through faulty valves during the long journey from England. Out of 19 cylinders, only a handful were truly reliable. He wrote home with a sense of mounting frustration, describing the gear as hopeless and ridiculously clumsy. He felt a deep sense of responsibility. If the machines failed at 28,000 feet, no amount of courage could save them. So, he turned his attention to the Mark V apparatus, determined to strip away every unnecessary ounce and seal every treacherous leak before they made their final gamble against the altitude. The work was grueling. Imagine sitting in a small, flapping tent while the wind screams outside, trying to manipulate tiny brass screws and delicate rubber washers with fingers that have lost all feeling. Sandy spent hours redesigning the high-pressure tubing. In the original design, a long, flexible hose wrapped around the climber's body so they could adjust the flow from the front. But Sandy saw this for what it was, a liability. Every inch of tubing was another place for a leak to spring, another point of failure in the freezing cold. With the steady hand of a master watchmaker, he shortened the lines and moved the regulator so it sat directly against the steel bottle. It was a revolutionary change, one that forced the climber to reach behind their back to manage the flow, but it virtually eliminated the risk of a catastrophic hiss in the middle of a vertical pitch. Through these modifications, he managed to shave 5 pounds off the total weight, bringing the load down to a more manageable 28 pounds. It was a small victory, but on the slopes of Everest, 5 pounds can feel like the difference between walking on air and crawling through lead. The way they breathed this artificial air was also a matter of Sandy's refinement. They used a simple bite valve, a rubber mouthpiece that required the climber to clamp down with their teeth to release a steady stream of life-giving gas. It was visceral and demanding, forcing a rhythmic connection between the man and the machine. Sandy spent his evenings testing the flow rates, ensuring that a single cylinder could last for hours if managed with care. He calculated that at a rate of 1 liter per minute, they might just have enough time to reach the summit and return before the world went dark. There was a strange beauty in his obsession. While Mallory studied the rock faces and the shifting clouds, Sandy studied the pressure gauges and the integrity of the seals. He was the guardian of their breath, the silent architect of their survival. The other members of the expedition watched him with a mixture of amusement and awe, marveling at how this young man, the least experienced climber among them, had become the most indispensable part of the mission. By the time they reached the higher camps, the floor of their tent was often a mosaic of discarded copper wire and spare gaskets. To an outsider, it looked like chaos, but to Sandy, it was the aftermath of optimization. He was building a bridge of oxygen that would carry them into the death zone, a place where the human body begins to consume itself just to stay warm. Every time he tightened a connection, he was buying Mallory a few more minutes of clarity. Every time he polished a valve, he was pushing back the onset of the crushing fatigue that had defeated so many before them. Mallory, who had once been a skeptic of artificial aid, now looked at Sandy and his machines with a desperate kind of hope. He saw in the young man a vitality and a technical brilliance that complemented his own fading physical strength. They were a team of 2 halves, one providing the will, the other providing the way. As the sun dipped below the jagged horizon, casting long, violet shadows across the Rongbuk Glacier, Sandy finally set down his tools. The sets were as ready as they would ever be, humming with the promise of the English air, waiting for the morning when they would finally be put to the ultimate test. The transition from the rock-strewn moraine to the vertical world of the North Col was abrupt and unforgiving. As the team moved beyond the relatively stable expanse of the East Rongbuk Glacier, the terrain shifted into a frozen verticality that seemed to defy the very laws of gravity. The base of the North Col wall loomed above them, a massive staircase of blue-veined ice and shifting snow that reached into the thin, freezing sky. Every step now required a deliberate, agonizing choice. The ice was not merely frozen water. It was a living, groaning entity that echoed with deep, percussive cracks under the weight of their boots. They moved in a single file, connected by thin hemp ropes that felt woefully inadequate against the sheer scale of the surrounding peaks. The air began to lose its substance, becoming a sharp, cold vapor that tasted of nothing but altitude and ancient dust. Sandy Irvine, despite his relative lack of mountaineering experience, found himself leading the way through sections where the ice became a chimney. A narrow vertical passage where the only way forward was to press his back against one wall and his boots against the other. To aid the porters, Sandy had used his engineering skills to help construct a 60-foot rope ladder that hung precariously against the ice face. The sound of his own breathing became the primary soundtrack of his existence, a rhythmic, ragged rasping that filled his ears and drowned out the distant howl of the wind. Above him, the ice wall shimmered with a deceptive, turquoise beauty, reflecting the pale sunlight in shades of silver. Below, the valley floor was falling away into a hazy, monochromatic distance. Every few minutes, he would pause to check the pressure gauges on the heavy oxygen tanks. The metal was so cold it seemed to burn through his layers of wool and tweed, a heavy, unyielding weight that promised life, but demanded a heavy price in physical exertion. As they reached the midpoint of the ascent, the psychological pressure began to manifest as a physical weight in the chest. George Mallory was often ahead, a dark silhouette against the blinding white, his movements driven by a decade of obsession. Sandy, however, felt the mountain differently. He was the youngest, the strongest in raw muscle, yet he was also a stranger to this high-altitude purgatory. He watched the way the light played across the jagged ridges of the North Ridge and felt a strange, quiet humility. The mountain did not care about British prestige or the mechanical ingenuity of their breathing apparatus. It was an indifferent giant, and they were merely tiny, colored specks crawling across its skin. The silence at this height was profound, broken only by the sharp chink of ice axes and the occasional, terrifying roar of an avalanche echoing from the hidden faces of the peaks. Camp 4 was finally established on a narrow, windswept shelf of ice tucked just below the lip of the North Col. It was a precarious sanctuary, a handful of canvas tents clinging to the edge of the world at 23,000 feet. Setting up the camp was a battle against the very air. Every movement, from hammering a peg to unfolding a sleeping bag, took 3 times as long as it should have. The wind here was a constant, predatory presence, whipping around the corners of the ice cliffs with a high-pitched scream. Inside the tents, the atmosphere was one of forced normalcy. They melted ice for tea, the small Primus stoves providing a flickering, rhythmic hiss that offered a fragile sense of domesticity. But the walls of the tent were paper-thin, and through the fabric, they could feel the immense, cold pressure of the Himalayan night pressing in from all sides. It was at this elevation, during the final days of May in 1924, that the weather began its slow, inevitable turn. The sky, which had been a clear, piercing sapphire for days, began to soften into a bruised, leaden gray. The clouds did not move like normal clouds. They seemed to rise from the valleys below like a rising tide, swallowing the lower ridges in a thick, suffocating mist. The psychological toll of this shift was immediate. The climbers knew that the window of opportunity was narrowing with every passing hour. The monsoon was coming, a seasonal leviathan that would soon bury the mountain in impassable drifts of snow. Sandy sat in the dim light of the tent, his hands cracked and blackened by the cold, listening to the fabric snap and pop in the gusts. He felt the isolation of the North Col deep in his bones, a sense that they had crossed a threshold from which there was no simple return. As the night deepened at Camp 4, the temperature plummeted, turning the moisture from their breath into a fine layer of rime frost that covered everything inside the tent. The physical exhaustion was so total that it bordered on a trance, yet true sleep remained elusive. Every time Sandy closed his eyes, he felt the sensation of falling, a vertigo born of the sheer drops that surrounded their tiny plateau. Mallory spoke little now, his focus narrowed to the singular goal of the summit. They were no longer just men climbing a mountain. They were participants in a high-altitude fever dream. The base of operations was firm, and the oxygen sets were as ready as they would ever be, but the mountain was beginning to breathe back at them. The North Call was merely the gatehouse, and as the wind rose to a shriek, they realized the true trial was only just beginning. The air at 26,000 feet is a thin, crystalline veil that tastes of ancient ice and nothingness. For Noel Odell, the world had shrunk to the rhythmic strike of his geological hammer against the dark, crumbly limestone of the North Face. It was the afternoon of June 8th, 1924. While the rest of the world turned in the warmth of early summer, Odell was a solitary figure suspended in a landscape of gray rock and blinding white snow. He was the support, the silent witness following in the wake of George Mallory and Sandy Irvine. His task was to move upward toward the high camp, keeping a watchful eye on the men who were even now pushing toward the roof of the world. The silence was absolute, broken only by the rasp of his own breath and the occasional moan of a wind that felt as though it had traveled across the entire span of the continent just to reach this lonely ridge. Odell was a man of science, a geologist who found comfort in the immutable history of stone. Even here, on the edge of the habitable world, he could not help but look for the stories written in the earth. Just before 12:50 in the afternoon, he found them. His hands, numbed by the biting cold, pulled a fragment of rock from the mountainside that contained the unmistakable impression of a fossil. It was a fragment of a creature from a sea that had existed millions of years ago, now resting at the highest point on the planet. For a moment, the weight of his mission fell away, replaced by a deep sense of jubilation. He stood alone on a small crag, the tiny fossil in his palm, feeling a profound connection to the passage of time. But as he looked up from his discovery, the heavy mists that had been swaddling the summit for hours began to shift. The gray curtain of cloud, thick and impenetrable, suddenly tore open as if an invisible hand had swept it aside. The sky above was a deep, terrifying shade of indigo, the kind of blue that only exists where the atmosphere is at its thinnest. In that sudden, sharp clarity, the entire summit ridge was unveiled. The final pyramid of Everest stood sharp and jagged against the heavens, stripped of its cloud cover. Odell's eyes searched the skyline, scanning the immense rock steps that guarded the way to the peak. And then he saw it. A tiny black speck, no larger than a pinhead, was silhouetted against a small crest of snow. It was a sharp contrast, the deep black of a human form against the brilliant, shimmering white of the high-altitude snow. The speck moved. It wasn't the erratic jitter of a hallucination or the shifting of a shadow. It was the purposeful, steady movement of a man. Odell held his breath, his heart hammering against his ribs as he watched the figure approach the base of a great rock step. A second speck appeared, trailing the first. They were two tiny dots, moving with what Odell would later describe as considerable alacrity. To see them moving so strongly at such a height was a marvel. He watched as the first figure reached the base of the formidable second step, a vertical wall of rock that looked like a jagged tooth against the sky. The figure didn't hesitate. With a grace that seemed impossible in the thin air, the first speck began to scale the obstacle, soon emerging at the very top. The second figure followed, repeating the movement. They were going strong. They were moving toward the summit, seemingly invincible against the backdrop of the void. Odell felt a surge of hope, so powerful it warmed him through his layers of wool and windproof silk. In his mind, they were hours behind schedule, yet there they were, surmounting the final barriers with a speed that suggested they would reach the top before the sun began to dip. But as quickly as the vision had appeared, it began to fade. The mountain, as if regretting its brief moment of transparency, began to pull the mists back around its shoulders. The clouds rolled in from the valleys below, thick and wet, swirling upward in great white plumes. The blue sky was swallowed. The summit ridge vanished. The two specks, just as they were nearing the final pyramid, were enveloped in the gray veil. Odell waited, his eyes straining against the gathering gloom, hoping for one more glimpse, one more sign that his friends were still there. But the window had closed. The world returned to its muffled, monochromatic state. He stood there for a long time, the fossils still clutched in his hand, looking at the place where they had been. He was the last person to see them. He didn't know then that he was watching them walk out of history and into the realm of ghosts. As the wind picked up, carrying the first hints of a coming storm, Odell turned to continue his own climb toward the empty camp. The silence of the mountain felt different now, heavier, more expectant. The two specks against the sky remained burned into his vision, two souls defying the limits of human endurance. He carried the image with him as he trudged through the soft snow, a flickering candle of hope against the encroaching dark. Below him, the vast glaciers of Tibet lay in shadow, and above him, the mystery was beginning to freeze into place. The mountain had taken its secret back into the clouds, leaving only the memory of two figures ascending, forever moving upward toward the stars, while the rest of the world slept on in the valleys far below. Mountain was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic crunch of his crampons against the ancient, frozen scree. Noel Odell moved with the heavy, deliberate pace of a man who had already spent nearly 2 weeks living in the thin, punishing air above 23,000 feet. Every single breath was a negotiation with the atmosphere, a shallow intake of cold that felt like needles in his chest. On this day, June 10th, 1924, he was no longer a climber seeking a summit. He was a witness seeking a sign. The sky above him was a deep, startling blue, so dark it almost hinted at the blackness of space, and the wind carried a crystalline bite that stung any patch of exposed skin. He kept his head down, focusing on the gray limestone of the north face, his eyes searching for anything that did not belong to the mountain's natural architecture. The camp eventually came into view, a lonely, fragile speck against the vastness of the rock. At 26,800 feet, the single tent of Camp 6 looked like a wounded bird clinging to a narrow ledge. One of its poles had partially collapsed under the weight of the recent storm, causing the canvas to sag and flap listlessly in the breeze. Odell stopped several yards away, his heart hammering against his ribs, the sound loud in the silence of the high altitude. He called out the names of his friends, George, Sandy, but his voice had no power here. It was thin and weak, instantly stolen by the wind and tossed into the great, empty couloirs. There was no answering shout, no movement from within the sagging fabric. The only sound was the rhythmic, frantic snapping of the tent sky lines. He reached the entrance and pulled back the flap, the frozen canvas stiff and resisting his touch. As he peered inside, the air felt unnervingly still, heavy with a cold that seemed deeper than the air outside. It was a scene frozen in time, exactly as it must have looked when Mallory and Irvine stepped out into the mist 2 mornings earlier. A mixed assortment of their life on the mountain was scattered across the floor. He saw spare warm clothes, half-eaten tins of meat and biscuits, and the skeletal remains of the oxygen apparatus. Bits of wire and small tools were strewn about, evidence of the hours Sandy Irvine had spent tinkering with the faulty valves. Odell reached out and touched a pair of thick, woolen socks, feeling the lingering frost on the fibers. Everything was in its place, yet the silence of the objects was deafening. His gaze settled on the small Primus stove sitting near the center of the tent. At this altitude, the stove was the heartbeat of the camp. It was the only way to melt snow for the hydration that kept the body from failing. Odell knelt, his knees cracking in the cold, and placed a gloved hand on the metal. It was ice cold. There was no sign that a flame had touched it since he himself had been here days before. No soot, no warmth, no smell of paraffin. It was the most terrifying realization of all. If George and Sandy had returned, even for a few hours of sleep, they would have used this stove to brew tea. The fact that it remained cold meant they had never come back. They had disappeared into the clouds on the 8th of June and had never stepped foot inside this sanctuary again. A wave of profound loneliness washed over him, but he forced himself to stand. He could not give up yet. He stepped out of the tent and began to scramble upward, moving toward the base of the summit pyramid. For nearly 2 hours, he wandered across the treacherous slopes of the yellow band, peering into every shadow and crevice. He whistled and yodeled, his voice cracking, hoping for any signal from the heights. He looked for a dropped oxygen cylinder or the glint of an ice axe in the snow. But the mountain revealed nothing. The fresh powder from the recent squall had blanketed the rocks, smoothing over any footprints or signs of a struggle. The north face was a blank page, its secrets hidden beneath a layer of pristine, indifferent white. Exhausted and breathless, Odell knew he had to deliver the news. He and the men below had devised a simple, primitive way to communicate across the miles of vertical space. He dragged the 2 heavy, dark-colored sleeping bags out from the tent and onto a nearby patch of flat, white snow. Moving with the slow, heavy grace of a man in a dream, he arranged them carefully. He laid one across the other, forming a large, dark cross against the brilliant white. From the North Col and the Eagle's Nest, thousands of feet below, the watchers would be peering through their long-distance telescopes. When they saw that dark shape, they would know the truth. It was a silent, agonizing message, no trace found, given up hope, awaiting orders. Before beginning his descent, Odell ducked his head back into the tent one last time. He reached for George Mallory's compass, the small brass instrument that now felt strangely heavy in his hand. He also took a specific component from the oxygen set, a small relic of Sandy's technical skill. He could not carry much, but these items were a bridge back to the world of the living. He pulled the tent flap shut, leaving the spare clothes and the remaining food to the ice. As he turned his back on Camp 6 and began the long, solitary trek down toward the lower camps, the mist began to roll in once more. The mountain was drawing its curtains, leaving the 2 men to their eternal rest in the high, thin air, while Noel Odell walked alone into the gathering shadows. The mountain held its breath for many seasons. For 50 years, the north face of Everest remained a place of ghosts and heavy silence, a vertical desert where the only voices were the shrieking winds and the occasional groan of moving ice. Below, in the valleys and the cities of the world, time marched forward through wars, technological revolutions, and the changing of empires. Yet, near the roof of the world, the secrets of 1924 remained locked in a deep, crystalline vault. The legends of Mallory and Irvine had settled into the dust of history books, appearing more like myth than reality. It was not until the middle of the 1970s that the silence was finally punctured by the arrival of a new generation of seekers, and the whispers began to take on a physical shape. In 1975, a massive Chinese expedition arrived at the base of the mountain, their red flags fluttering against the stark white of the Rongbuk Glacier. They were there with the strength of hundreds, determined to conquer the heights. Among them was a climber named Wang Hongbao. One afternoon, while stationed at a high-altitude camp nearly 8,100 meters above the sea, Wang stepped out of his tent for a short walk. The air was thin and brittle, and every breath felt like inhaling needles of ice. He walked for perhaps 20 minutes, moving through a landscape of shattered shale and ancient snow, when he saw something that did not belong to the natural order of the mountain. There, resting against the incline as if taking a momentary nap, was a body. Wang approached the figure with a mixture of reverence and dread. This was no modern climber in vibrant nylon or down-filled suits. The clothing was dark and heavy, the texture of old wool and gabardine that had been bleached by decades of relentless solar radiation. When Wang reached out to touch the fabric, He later recounted that it broke into tiny bits under his fingers, caught by the wind and carried away like gray ash. He noted a hole in the cheek of the fallen man, a haunting detail that suggested the violence of a fall or the slow erosion of the elements. He did not know the name of the man he had found, but he knew he was looking at a relic from a different age. He performed a simple, quiet burial, covering the remains with stones and snow before retreating back to the safety of his camp. For 4 years, Wang kept this encounter to himself, a secret carried through the quiet nights of his life. It was only in 1979, during a joint reconnaissance mission with a Japanese team, that he finally spoke. In a high-altitude tent, struggling against a language barrier and the exhaustion of the climb, Wang spoke to the Japanese leader, Ryoten Hasegawa. He repeated the words English, English, pointing toward the upper slopes of the north face. He described the old-fashioned clothing and the location near the campsite of 1924. Hasegawa listened with growing intensity, realizing that Wang might have solved the greatest mystery in mountaineering. But the mountain is a jealous keeper of its stories. Only one day after sharing his discovery, Wang Hongbao was swept away by a sudden avalanche. He vanished into a crevasse, taking the exact coordinates of his find into the deep blue shadows of the glacier. With Wang's death, the rumors grew into a century of whispers. The search for the climbers became inextricably linked to the search for a small, black object, the Kodak Vest pocket camera. Historians and scientists believed that if the camera could be found, the cold of the mountain might have acted as a natural freezer, preserving the 127 film inside for decades. They dreamed of developing that film in a darkroom, watching the grain of the silver halides reveal the truth of whether Mallory and Irvine had stood upon the summit 3 decades before any other human. The camera became a holy grail, a mechanical witness that could rewrite the history of exploration. Rumors began to circulate that the camera had already been found by the Chinese in 1975 and whisked away to a museum in Beijing, kept under lock and key to protect a national narrative. These stories turned the North Face into a site of forensic obsession. Expeditions in the late 20th century were no longer just about reaching the top. They were about scouring the limestone terraces for a flash of metal or a scrap of tweed. They searched the area Wang had described, a place known as the Snow Terrace, where the wind scours the ground bare and the light can play tricks on the eyes. Every dark rock became a potential body, every shadow a potential clue. The world waited for a sign, for a single piece of evidence that could survive the crushing weight of 100 years. As the 1990s approached, the mountain remained indifferent, its high ridges still veiled in the same swirling clouds that had swallowed 2 young men on a June afternoon so very long ago. The 1st of May, 1999, dawned with a clarity that is both rare and terrifying at such high altitudes. On the north face of Mount Everest, the air is so thin that every breath feels like a hard-won victory. A small, elite group of climbers known as the Mallory and Irvine Research Expedition moved with deliberate, heavy steps across a vast, sloping terrace of snow and jagged rock. This area, tilted at a steep 30-degree angle and roughly the size of 12 football pitches, was their search grid. They were looking for ghosts, guided by a singular, haunting clue from 24 years earlier when a Chinese climber had reported seeing the remains of an English dead. The wind sang through the riggings of their gear, a lonely, high-pitched whistle that seemed to carry the echoes of the men who had vanished into this very landscape 75 years before. It was Conrad Anker who first broke the rhythm of the search. He was scanning the gray scree when he spotted something that defied the natural geometry of the mountain. It was a patch of white, but not the bright, crystalline white of fresh snow. Instead, it was something more solid, like a block of alabaster or a marble statue half submerged in the frozen earth. As he scrambled closer, his heart hammered against his ribs in the thin air. It was a body lying face down, his arms outstretched and fingers dug into the frozen ground as if he were still trying to arrest a slide. The skin, exposed to the elements for decades, had been bleached to a brilliant, translucent white by the high-altitude sun, yet it remained remarkably intact. The muscles of the shoulders and legs were still visible, a testament to the sheer physical power of the man before his fall. The team gathered in a circle of hushed reverence, the only sound the crunch of their own boots on the ice and the distant roar of the wind. They had fully expected to find Sandy Irvine, the younger, less experienced partner whose location had been the subject of so much speculation for generations. But as they gently began to examine the tattered remains of the clothing, comprising 6 delicate layers of silk, cotton, and wool, they found a series of small, woven name tags stitched into the fabric. They read the letters G. Mallory. A heavy silence fell over the group. This was not the student, this was the master. They were in the presence of George Lee Mallory himself, the man whose name had become synonymous with the mystery of Everest. He had been lying here, just 2,000 feet below the summit, since the 8th of June, 1924. The physical evidence of Mallory's final moments was etched into his very frame. His right leg was severely broken. Both the tibia and fibula snapped just above the top of his green leather hobnail boot. His right elbow appeared dislocated, and his ribs showed signs of heavy impact. Most evocative of all were the rope marks. Dark, deep indentations were visible around his waist, where a heavy climbing rope had once been tied. The rope itself was found still wrapped around his torso, its end frayed and broken. It told a story of a fall that had been momentarily halted by a partner, a sudden, violent jerk that likely caused the internal injuries before the line finally gave way. This snap sent Mallory tumbling down the north face until he came to rest on this lonely, sloping shelf. In the pockets of his fragile, wind-whipped clothes, the team discovered a treasure trove of personal artifacts that felt almost too intimate to touch. There was a brass altimeter, its glass shattered, and a pocket knife with a pearl handle. They found a box of matches, a monogrammed handkerchief, and several letters from his family, including one from his sister. Crucially, they found a pair of sun goggles tucked safely inside a pocket. This small detail spoke volumes to the investigators. If he was not wearing his goggles, it strongly suggested he was either climbing in the darkness of night or the dim light of dusk. Most poignant, however, was what they did not find. Mallory had famously told his children he would leave a photograph of his wife, Ruth, on the very top of the world. That photograph was not among his possessions, sparking hope that he may have reached the peak. While the discovery of Mallory provided answers, it also deepened the void regarding Sandy Irvine. The team spent the following days scouring the surrounding slopes with metal detectors, hoping for a signal that would lead them to the younger climber, or, more importantly, to the vest pocket Kodak camera they believed Irvine had been carrying. They searched the ridges and the hidden gullies, but the mountain would not yield its second secret. The camera, which might contain the only photographic proof of a 1924 summit, remained hidden in the ice. With the weather turning and their oxygen low, the team performed a final, somber task. They buried George Mallory where he lay, covering him with heavy stones to protect him from the elements, leaving the mystery of Sandy Irvine to drift further into the shadows of the North Face. For 100 years, the central Rongbuk Glacier guarded its secrets with a cold, unrelenting grip. This massive river of ice, carving its way down from the north face of Mount Everest, is not a static tomb, but a slow-moving conveyor belt of frost and stone. It shifts and moans, grinding the history of the mountain into its depths. While the discovery of George Mallory in 1999 provided a somber landmark on the high slopes, Sandy Irvine remained a ghost, a name whispered in the wind, his final resting place lost somewhere in the vast, tumbled chaos of the lower ice fields. The world had almost resigned itself to the idea that he might never be found. that the mountain had claimed him so completely that not a single trace of his existence would ever resurface. Then came the month of September in the year 2024. The high mountain summer had been particularly harsh, and the ice was receding, melting away in ways that exposed the bones of the earth. A documentary team, led by the renowned climber and filmmaker Jimmy Chin, along with his companions Erich Roepke and Mark Fisher, was moving across the glacier below the North Face. They were not specifically hunting for Sandy that day. They were explorers immersed in the rhythm of the mountain, their eyes scanning the blue-white horizon. But the glacier, after a century of silence, was finally ready to relinquish a small, precious fragment of the past. It began with a dark shape, a smudge of color against the blinding white expanse that didn't belong to the natural world of rock and snow. As they drew closer, the shape resolved into something hauntingly familiar to anyone who knows the history of early mountaineering. Protruding from the melting ice was a boot. It was not a modern boot of synthetic plastics and bright neons, but a sturdy, weathered object of dark brown leather. The team knelt in the snow, the air thin and quiet around them. The boot was a hobnailed relic, the kind worn by the pioneers of the 1920s. Its leather was cracked and smoothed by decades of glacial movement, yet it remained remarkably intact. To see it there, sitting alone on the ice, was like looking through a tear in the fabric of time. They realized immediately that they were standing over a piece of history that had been missing for exactly 1 century. With delicate care, they examined the find. Inside the boot, they discovered the remains of a foot, still encased in a thick woolen sock. The fabric was heavy, designed to ward off the lethal cold of the high altitudes. As Jimmy Chin gently moved the material, he spotted a small, red label stitched into the cuff of the sock. In white block letters, the name was perfectly legible despite the passage of 10 decades. A.C. Irvine. The breath left the team in a collective gasp. There it was. No longer a theory, no longer a legend, but a physical reality. Andrew Kamin Irvine, the young man who had vanished into the mist on June 8, 1924, had finally been found. The discovery was so sudden and so profound that the team found themselves overcome with emotion, pacing in small circles on the ice, trying to process the weight of what they were witnessing. This was the first real evidence of Sandy's fate since he and Mallory were last seen as tiny dots near the summit. The location of the boot, much further down the glacier than where Mallory's body was found, told a silent story of its own. It suggested a catastrophic fall, a journey through the vertical world that ended in the crushing flow of the glacier. For Julie Summers, Sandy's great-niece and biographer, the news brought a flood of tears. She had grown up with the legend of her Uncle Sandy, a vibrant 22-year-old whose life was frozen in time. To hear that his name had been found, stitched by his own hand, or perhaps his mother's into the very clothing he wore on his final day, brought a sense of poignant closure that had eluded the family for 3 generations. The discovery in 2024 has reignited the fire of the greatest mystery in climbing. While the boot and the sock provide a definitive end to the search for Sandy's physical remains, they also sharpen the focus on what is still missing. The camera, the small Kodak device that might hold the photograph of a lifetime, was not found with the boot. However, the search area has now narrowed. The mountain has given up a limb, a boot, and a name, signaling that perhaps it is ready to tell the rest of the story. As the news rippled across the globe, the image of that lone leather boot on the central Rongbuk Glacier became a symbol of endurance. We now know where Sandy ended his journey, but the question of how far he climbed before the ice took him remains a ghost, waiting for the next summer thaw to speak. The air on the central Rongbuk Glacier is thin, brittle, and impossibly cold, even in the late summer sun. In September of 2024, a small team of explorers led by photographer and filmmaker Jimmy Chin moved across this vast, undulating landscape of ice and stone. They were not looking for a ghost that day. They were simply documenting the mountain, respecting its staggering scale. But Mount Everest has a way of surrendering its secrets only when it chooses. Beneath the towering, jagged shadows of the north face, the team noticed a dark shape emerging from the blue-white crust of the glacier. It was a fragment of the past, slowly being pushed back into the light by the grinding movement of the ice. As they approached, the silence of the high altitude seemed to deepen, as if the mountain itself were finally ready to tell the rest of a story that had been frozen for 100 years. What they found was a boot. It was not the neon-bright, synthetic footwear of a modern climber, but a heavy relic of a different era. The leather was cracked and worn, darkened by decades of exposure to the elements, yet still holding the shape of the foot it once protected. On the sole, the diamond-patterned steel hobnails glinted faintly in the harsh light. These were the same iron studs that had bit into the ice on June 8, 1924. Seeing such a physical, tactile object in the middle of that frozen wilderness was a visceral experience for the team. It was a bridge across a century, a tangible connection to a young man who had stepped off into the mists and never returned. The explorers stood in a circle, their own heavy breathing the only sound against the white canvas of the glacier, staring at a boot that had likely melted out of its icy tomb just days before they arrived. Then came the moment of absolute clarity. Jimmy Chin reached down and carefully lifted the wool of the sock that was still tucked inside the leather. There, stitched into a small red label in elegant, simple lettering, were the words, AC. Irvine. It was a name that had been whispered in climbing circles for generations, a name that represented the ultimate mystery of mountaineering history. Andrew Kamin Irvine, known to all as Sandy, was no longer just a legend or a footnote in George Mallory's grand tragedy. He was right there. The discovery was electric, sending a shock of emotion through the seasoned climbers. After 100 years of theories, of searching, and of false leads, the mountain had finally offered up the identity of the man who had occupied its heights for so long. Sandy Irvine was only 22 years old when he disappeared. He was the youngest member of the 1924 expedition, an Oxford student known for his strength and his mechanical brilliance. While George Mallory provided the poetic drive for the ascent, Sandy was the one who kept the primitive oxygen sets functioning, working with his hands to ensure they had a fighting chance against the thin air. For a century, the world had wondered where he had gone. When Mallory's remains were found much higher up in 1999, it answered half of the question, but Sandy remained a shadow. Some believed his body had been moved by others. Others thought he had been lost to the bottomless crevasses. But finding him here, at a lower altitude on the glacier, suggested a long, final descent or a fall that carried him far from the upper slopes where they were last seen going strong for the top. The news traveled from the silent heights of the Himalaya back to the green valleys of England. For Sandy's family, particularly his great-niece and biographer Julie Summers, the phone call was a moment of profound, tearful relief. She had lived with the mystery of her Uncle Sandy since she was a child, a story woven into the very fabric of her family's identity. To have definitive information, to know that he was still there, and that he had been found by people who treated his memory with such respect, brought a sense of closure that had been missing for 3 generations. The discovery also served to debunk the more cynical theories of the past. Instead, the truth was much more poetic. The mountain had held him close, shielding him in its icy embrace until the world was ready to remember him once more. And yet, even with this discovery, the greatest mystery of all remains tucked away in the ice. Historians and climbers still hold their breath for the camera, the small Kodak pocket camera that Sandy was known to be carrying. It has long been the holy grail of exploration. If that camera is ever found, and if the film can be developed through modern forensic techniques, we might finally know if those 2 tiny black dots actually stood on the roof of the world 29 years before Hillary and Tenzing. This discovery in 2024 does not yet answer that final question, but it narrows the search. It places Sandy on the map, It reminds us that the mountain is a library of history, its pages written in ice and stone, waiting for the wind and the sun to turn them for us to read. As the sun sets over the north face, casting long, violet shadows across the central Rongbuk Glacier, we are left to meditate on the spirit of these two men. They were driven by a curiosity that outweighed their fear, a desire to see what lay beyond the next ridge, even when the air itself became a ghost. There is a strange, quiet peace in knowing that Sandy Irvine is no longer lost to the void. He has been acknowledged. He has been named. The legacy of his bravery and the mystery of his final hours continue to inspire those who look toward the horizon and wonder at the unknown. The mountain remains, indifferent and magnificent, a monument to the human will to climb, to explore, and to seek the truth, no matter how many years must pass before it is revealed. We think of the young man from Birkenhead, the hobnailed boots, and the red label on a woolen sock. The story of 1924 has reached its resting point, where the facts finally meet the legend in the thin, cold air. The case rests now. Let the details fade. You are safe. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and have a good night. Sleep well.